A nuclear weapon launched today would reach its target in 72 minutes and kill 60 to 70% of human life on Earth. In January 1995, Russian radar operators detected what appeared to be a submarine-launched ballistic missile heading toward Moscow. President Boris Yeltsin activated his nuclear briefcase and prepared to retaliate. The object turned out to be a Norwegian scientific rocket studying the aurora. We came within minutes of nuclear war over a weather experiment. I've spent months interviewing nuclear weapons scientists, former defense officials, and military commanders to understand how the nuclear threat has evolved as we enter 2025. What I discovered terrified me. The weapons are more devastating than ever before, delivery systems have made previous timelines obsolete, and the margin for error has shrunk to mere minutes. But the most dangerous change is something far more fundamental about who controls these weapons. 9 nuclear powers, the new players who changed everything. The Cold War established 5 nuclear powers recognized by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. Today we have 9. This expansion represents the most dangerous shift in global security since the atomic age began. 4 additional nations have crossed the nuclear threshold, each bringing regional tensions and unpredictable decision-making into what was once a carefully managed two-superpower standoff. India detonated its first nuclear device in 1974, calling it a peaceful nuclear explosion. Pakistan followed in 1998 after India conducted additional tests. North Korea joined in 2006 with its first underground nuclear test. Israel maintains nuclear ambiguity, but intelligence estimates suggest they developed weapons in the late 1960s. These nations fundamentally altered how nuclear deterrence works. Each new nuclear power imports its own regional conflicts into the global nuclear equation. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars since 1947 and maintain hostile borders where nuclear-armed soldiers face each other daily. Recent expert estimates indicate Pakistan has deployed tactical nuclear warheads within 150 miles of the Indian border, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist's 2022 Nuclear Notebook. The Kargil conflict in 1999 brought both nations to the brink of nuclear escalation over disputed territory most people cannot locate on a map. North Korea presents an entirely different challenge. Kim Jong-un inherited absolute power over nuclear weapons at age 27 with no checks on his authority. Intelligence analysts struggle to predict his decision-making patterns because North Korea operates as a sealed information environment. Unlike established nuclear powers with extensive command structures, North Korea concentrates nuclear authority in a single unpredictable leader who views nuclear weapons as essential to regime survival. Israel operates under a doctrine of nuclear opacity, neither confirming nor denying its nuclear capabilities. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israeli leaders reportedly prepared nuclear weapons for potential use, as revealed in declassified Kissinger notes. This deliberate ambiguity complicates crisis calculations for neighboring countries and creates blind spots in global nuclear oversight. Traditional Cold War deterrence theory assumed rational actors with clear communication channels and shared understanding of escalation dynamics. That framework collapses when 9 different nuclear doctrines interact simultaneously. The United States and Soviet Union developed elaborate protocols for managing nuclear crises through decades of practice. New nuclear powers lack this institutional knowledge and crisis management experience. Nuclear decision-making now involves leaders with radically different cultural backgrounds, strategic thinking, and political constraints. American presidents face congressional oversight and alliance consultations. Russian leaders operate within different institutional frameworks. Indian prime ministers answer to coalition governments. Pakistani military leaders influence nuclear decisions alongside civilian authorities. These varied decision-making processes create unpredictable interaction effects during crises. Regional nuclear rivalries create cascading escalation risks that bypass superpower control. The Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan operates independently of US-Russia nuclear dynamics. A border skirmish in the Himalayas could trigger nuclear escalation without involving traditional nuclear superpowers. Similarly, tensions on the Korean peninsula exist outside the framework of US-China strategic competition. Alliance structures further complicate nuclear calculations. NATO's nuclear umbrella extends American nuclear guarantees to 30 countries. If Russia attacked Estonia, would the United States risk nuclear war over a nation most Americans cannot locate? Similar questions arise with American security guarantees to Japan, South Korea, and Australia. These extended deterrence commitments create multiple pathways to nuclear conflict. Proxy conflicts between nuclear powers generate additional escalation risks. The war in Ukraine demonstrates how conventional conflicts involving nuclear powers can produce nuclear threats. Russia's nuclear saber-rattling attempts to deter Western military support for Ukraine. Iran's nuclear program advancement occurs alongside proxy conflicts with Israel across the Middle East. These indirect confrontations between nuclear powers create hair-trigger scenarios where miscalculation could trigger nuclear escalation. Intelligence agencies now monitor 9 separate nuclear programs with varying levels of transparency and accessibility. Tracking Soviet nuclear activities during the Cold War required enormous resources focused on a single adversary. Today, intelligence services must simultaneously monitor Chinese nuclear modernization, Pakistani tactical weapons deployment, North Korean missile development, and Iranian enrichment activities. This distributed monitoring challenge stretches intelligence capabilities and increases the likelihood of surprise developments. Command and control systems across 9 nuclear powers operate on incompatible technologies and protocols. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev could communicate through established diplomatic channels. Today, crisis communications would require coordination across multiple time zones, languages, and political systems simultaneously. The technical challenges of maintaining reliable communication, links between 9 nuclear command authorities during a crisis exceed anything previously attempted. Nuclear weapons employment policies vary dramatically across the 9 nuclear powers. Russia maintains tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use. Pakistan has developed short-range nuclear missiles specifically for use against Indian armored divisions. North Korea threatens preemptive nuclear strikes against perceived threats. These diverse nuclear doctrines create multiple escalation pathways that did not exist during the bipolar Cold War period. The transformation from 5 to 9 nuclear powers represents more than numerical expansion. It fundamentally alters the nature of nuclear risk by introducing multiple unpredictable variables into what was once a carefully managed strategic relationship. Each additional nuclear power exponentially increases the complexity of crisis management and raises the statistical probability of nuclear conflict. But the expansion of nuclear powers tells only part of the story. The weapons themselves have evolved into something far more devastating than anything the original nuclear club ever possessed. 2025's arsenal, weapons that make Hiroshima look like a firecracker. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima measured 15 kilotons. Modern thermonuclear weapons measure their power in megatons. A single Russian RS-28 Sarmat missile carries warheads totaling 10 megatons of destructive force. That represents 67 times more explosive power than the weapon that killed 140,000 people in Hiroshima. Yet this monster weapon fits inside a package smaller than the original atomic bombs dropped in 1945. Physics explains this terrifying efficiency. The Hiroshima bomb used nuclear fission to split uranium atoms. Modern weapons use fusion reactions that combine hydrogen isotopes at temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees. Fusion releases exponentially more energy per unit of nuclear material. A thermonuclear weapon the size of a refrigerator can generate more explosive force than every conventional bomb dropped during World War II combined. The current global nuclear stockpile contains 12,241 warheads as of January 2025. Russia maintains approximately 6,257 warheads, while the United States possesses around 5,550. These 2 superpowers control 90% of all nuclear weapons on Earth. China accelerated its nuclear buildup and now maintains 500 warheads with projections showing continued rapid expansion. France maintains about 290 warheads including reserves with approximately 280 deployed. The United Kingdom 225, Pakistan 170, India 172, Israel approximately 90, and North Korea around 50 warheads. Within this total arsenal, 9,614 warheads remain in active military stockpiles available for immediate use. The remaining weapons await dismantlement in storage facilities. More concerning, 3,912 warheads are deployed with delivery systems including missiles, bombers, and submarines. Among deployed weapons, 2,100 warheads remain on high operational alert, meaning they can launch within minutes of receiving orders. Nuclear weapons technology advanced dramatically since the Cold War era. Modern warheads use insensitive high explosives that resist accidental detonation while maintaining devastating yield. Computer modeling replaced nuclear testing to design more efficient weapons without underground explosions. Enhanced radiation weapons concentrate lethal radiation while reducing blast damage to preserve infrastructure. Variable yield warheads allow commanders to dial explosive power from tactical levels measured in hundreds of tons to strategic levels exceeding 1 megaton. Multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles transformed nuclear warfare by allowing single missiles to destroy multiple targets simultaneously. The Russian RS-24 Yars missile carries 3 MIRV warheads that separate during flight to strike different cities hundreds of miles apart. American Minuteman III missiles deploy 3 warheads each. Chinese DF-41 missiles carry up to 10 MIRV warheads. This multiplication effect means fewer missiles can destroy exponentially more targets. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles evolved into virtually undetectable weapons platforms. Modern nuclear submarines operate underwater for months without surfacing while maintaining constant communication with command authorities. Russian Borei-class submarines carry 16 Bulava missiles, each with multiple warheads. American Ohio-class submarines deploy 20 Trident II missiles capable of striking targets 7,000 miles away. Chinese Jin-class submarines patrol with JL-3 missiles that can reach American cities from protected bastions in the South China Sea. Hypersonic nuclear delivery systems represent the newest technological leap in nuclear warfare. These weapons fly at speeds exceeding Mach 5 while maneuvering unpredictably to evade defensive systems. Russia deployed the Kinzhal hypersonic missile that can carry nuclear warheads and strike targets within 10 minutes. China tested the DFZF hypersonic glide vehicle that approaches targets at 7,000 miles per hour. The United States developed similar systems through classified programs that remain largely secret. Tactical nuclear weapons lowered the threshold for nuclear use by providing battlefield options that avoid massive civilian casualties. Russia maintains approximately 1,900 tactical warheads designed for short-range missiles, artillery shells, and torpedoes. These weapons produce yields between 1 and 50 kilotons, making them seem more usable than city-destroying strategic warheads. Pakistan developed tactical nuclear weapons specifically to counter Indian armored divisions advancing across their border. Military commanders view tactical weapons as extensions of conventional warfare rather than civilization-ending strategic weapons. Major nuclear powers implemented extensive modernization programs that expand capabilities while replacing aging systems. Russia allocated $700 billion over 20 years to completely rebuild its nuclear arsenal with new missiles, submarines, and bombers. The United States committed $1.7 trillion over 30 years to modernize every component of its nuclear triad. China constructed 350 new ICBM silos across 3 desert complexes while developing new mobile missiles and submarines. These programs suggest nuclear arsenals will grow larger and more sophisticated throughout the 2030s. The expiration of the New START Treaty in February 2026 removes the last major constraint on Russian and American nuclear expansion. This agreement limited both countries to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads and 800 deployed delivery vehicles. Without treaty restrictions, both nations could rapidly increase their deployed forces. Russia already violated treaty limits by deploying new heavy missiles that exceed agreed warhead totals. Intelligence assessments suggest both countries prepare to expand their arsenals significantly after treaty expiration. Artificial intelligence integration into nuclear command systems creates unprecedented automation in nuclear decision-making. Russian perimeter system reportedly uses computer algorithms to automatically launch nuclear missiles if Moscow gets destroyed. American early warning systems employ machine learning to identify incoming missile threats within seconds. Chinese nuclear forces integrate AI for target selection and damage assessment. These automated systems reduce human decision-making time, while potentially creating new pathways to accidental nuclear war. The combination of more nuclear powers possessing exponentially more powerful weapons creates unprecedented destructive potential concentrated in increasingly automated systems. But raw destructive power tells only part of the story. The speed at which these weapons can reach their targets has compressed the timeline for human decision-making to a terrifying degree. 90 minutes to annihilation, the new timeline of nuclear war. Modern detection systems identify launches within 5 seconds, but the complete timeline from first missile launch to global nuclear exchange spans 30 to 90 minutes depending on weapon systems and geographic positioning. Advanced satellite networks positioned 22,000 miles above Earth detect the heat signature from rocket engines before missiles clear their launch tubes. Ground-based radar systems confirm launches within 30 seconds. Yet this technological precision creates a paradox that makes nuclear war more dangerous than ever. Presidents and prime ministers receive launch notifications faster, but have less time to make decisions. The compression happens because modern missiles fly faster while carrying more destructive payloads. Intercontinental ballistic missiles travel at 15,000 miles per hour during their midcourse phase. A missile launch from Russia reaches American cities in 30 minutes. Chinese ICBMs require 33 minutes to hit targets on the US West Coast. These flight times remain constant, but new weapon systems eliminated precious minutes from the decision-making process. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles created the most dangerous compression in nuclear timelines. Nuclear submarines position themselves 200 miles offshore from major cities. Russian Bore submarines patrol 300 miles from the American coast, carrying 16 Bulava missiles. Each missile delivers multiple warheads to separate targets within 8 minutes of launch. American Ohio-class submarines maintain similar positions near Chinese and Russian coastlines. These underwater platforms eliminated the luxury of 30-minute warning times that ICBMs provide. Submarines launching from international waters reduce flight times to major population centers by 75%. New York City receives 7 minutes warning from a submarine-launched missile fired 200 miles offshore. Los Angeles gets 6 minutes. Moscow receives 8 minutes warning from an American submarine positioned in the Arctic Ocean. These compressed timelines assume perfect detection and communication systems functioning under extreme stress. Hypersonic weapons eliminated predictable flight paths that defense systems relied on for decades. Traditional ballistic missiles follow parabolic trajectories that computers calculate within minutes of launch. Hypersonic glide vehicles maneuver during flight while traveling at Mach 7. Russian Kinzhal missiles change course multiple times between launch and impact. Chinese DFZF hypersonic vehicles approach targets from unexpected angles. American officials confirmed these weapons reduce warning times to 5 minutes for some targets. The psychological pressure on leaders making nuclear decisions intensified as timelines compressed. Presidents must choose between nuclear retaliation and national destruction in the time most people need to order coffee. Sleep deprivation, medication, illness, or stress could affect decision-making during these critical minutes. Historical records show leaders struggled with nuclear decisions even when they had hours to deliberate. John Kennedy spent 13 days managing the Cuban Missile Crisis. Modern leaders get 13 minutes or less. Communication systems must transmit orders perfectly while operating under electromagnetic interference from nuclear explosions. High-altitude nuclear detonations generate electromagnetic pulses that disable electronic circuits across regions spanning 500 to 1,000 kilometers in radius, according to W-87 warhead EMP studies. Military communication networks use hardened systems designed to survive nuclear attacks, but commercial infrastructure collapses immediately. Presidential orders must reach missile commanders, submarine captains, and bomber crews through communication links that nuclear explosions actively disrupt. The cascade of events in the first 10 minutes after launch detection determines whether nuclear war remains limited or escalates to global destruction. Satellite warnings trigger automated alerts to national command authorities. Military advisors wake sleeping leaders while confirming launch authenticity. Intelligence analysts determine missile targets and probable impact times. Leaders receive briefings on response options while missiles fly toward their destinations. Each step requires flawless execution under extreme time pressure. Automated systems increasingly make preliminary decisions before human leaders get briefed. Russian perimeter system reportedly monitors communication links to Moscow and automatically launches retaliatory strikes if command centers get destroyed. Chinese early warning networks use artificial intelligence to identify incoming threats and recommend response options. American DEFCON alert levels trigger automatic military responses, including bomber dispersal and submarine alert status changes. These systems operate faster than human decision-making, but introduce new possibilities for malfunction. The compressed timeline makes accidental nuclear war statistically more likely because it multiplies opportunities for system failures and human errors. A Norwegian scientific rocket launch in 1995 triggered Russian early warning systems. Boris Yeltsin activated his nuclear briefcase and prepared to order retaliation before identifying the rocket as peaceful. Similar incidents occurred involving weather balloons, satellite malfunctions, and computer glitches. Each false alarm lasted several minutes during the Cold War. Modern compressed timelines provide seconds to identify mistakes. Technical malfunctions in early warning systems could trigger nuclear responses before humans verify threats. Computer failures at NORAD in 1979 showed 2,200 incoming Soviet missiles on warning screens. Military commanders prepared for nuclear war until technicians identified a training tape accidentally loaded into the system. The malfunction lasted 6 minutes. In 2025, similar technical failures might not allow enough time for human verification before automated systems recommend launch orders. Military officers at various command levels face independent decisions during nuclear crises. Submarine commanders lose contact with higher authority when operating underwater during attacks. Missile launch officers must verify orders received through communication systems damaged by nuclear explosions. Bomber crews require confirmation codes that might not transmit through disrupted networks. These distributed decision points multiply the human factors affecting nuclear escalation. The integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear command systems creates additional automation that operates faster than human oversight. Machine learning algorithms analyze threats and recommend responses within milliseconds. AI systems monitor global communications for nuclear-related keywords and alert patterns. Automated threat assessment programs evaluate multiple data sources simultaneously. These systems compress decision-making timelines while introducing new variables that human commanders cannot predict or control. Modern nuclear warfare unfolds in minutes rather than hours, transforming nuclear crises into rapid-fire sequences of automated responses and split-second human decisions. But these theoretical timelines assume nuclear weapons remain tools of last resort used only when national survival hangs in the balance. Recent global conflicts shattered that assumption completely. The Ukraine effect: how current wars created nuclear flashpoints. The invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, transformed nuclear weapons from Cold War relics into active instruments of modern warfare. Vladimir Putin's explicit nuclear threats during the conflict fundamentally altered how the world calculates nuclear danger. Within weeks of launching his invasion, Putin placed Russian nuclear forces on high alert and warned that countries interfering with his operation would face consequences they had never experienced in their history. These weren't subtle diplomatic signals or veiled references to nuclear capabilities. Putin spoke directly about nuclear weapons as tools of coercion against nations supporting Ukraine. Intelligence agencies scrambled to assess whether Putin's threats represented genuine preparation for nuclear use or strategic bluffing designed to fracture Western unity. The U.S. intelligence community reached alarming conclusions in fall 2022 when classified assessments warned of real risks that Putin might order tactical nuclear weapons if Russian troops became encircled by Ukrainian forces in Kherson. This intelligence triggered an urgent diplomatic campaign to warn Moscow about the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapon use. The fact that American analysts considered nuclear escalation over a single Ukrainian city demonstrated how fundamentally the conflict changed nuclear risk calculations. Putin's nuclear rhetoric established a new template for nuclear blackmail that exploited Western fears of nuclear war to limit military aid and constrain Ukrainian operations. Nuclear blackmail involves explicit threats to use nuclear weapons to achieve political objectives or deter adversary actions. Putin threatened nuclear responses to NATO arms deliveries, Western economic sanctions, and Ukrainian territorial gains. These threats aimed to fracture the coalition supporting Ukraine by raising the specter of nuclear escalation. The strategy demonstrated how nuclear weapons could function as diplomatic tools rather than weapons of last resort. Proxy conflicts between nuclear powers multiplied throughout the Ukraine war period, creating cascading escalation risks. The United States provided advanced weapons systems to Ukraine, while Russia received military support from China and North Korea. NATO members supplied intelligence, training, and equipment that directly enabled Ukrainian operations against Russian forces. These proxy relationships meant that nuclear powers were effectively fighting each other through Ukrainian and Russian surrogates, while maintaining the fiction of avoiding direct confrontation. The collapse of nuclear arms control architecture accelerated during the Ukraine conflict as both sides abandoned treaty obligations and verification mechanisms. Russia suspended participation in the New START treaty, ending inspection protocols and data exchanges that provided transparency about nuclear arsenals. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty had already terminated in 2019. The Open Skies Treaty died in 2020. By 2025, no meaningful arms control agreements constrain nuclear competition between major powers. This regulatory vacuum removes critical safeguards that prevented dangerous nuclear buildups during previous decades. NATO's nuclear umbrella created the most complex escalation scenarios since the alliance's founding. American nuclear weapons stationed in 5 European countries could potentially target Russian forces operating in Ukraine. The alliance's Article 5 mutual defense commitment means that any Russian attack on NATO territory would trigger collective response, including potential nuclear retaliation. Ukrainian operations launched from NATO countries could provide Russia with justification for attacking alliance territory. These overlapping commitments created multiple pathways for conventional conflict to escalate into nuclear warfare. Tactical nuclear weapons emerged as the most dangerous wildcard in regional conflicts because military commanders view them as usable battlefield tools rather than civilization-ending strategic weapons. Russia maintains 1,912 non-strategic nuclear warheads designed for short-range delivery against military targets. These weapons range from artillery shells, with yields measured in hundreds of tons, to missiles carrying warheads 20 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Military doctrine treats tactical nuclear weapons as extensions of conventional warfare rather than crossing the ultimate taboo of nuclear use. The integration of tactical nuclear weapons into conventional military operations lowered the threshold for nuclear use in ways that strategic planners never anticipated. Russian commanders trained for scenarios involving tactical nuclear strikes against Ukrainian armored formations or NATO reinforcement convoys. American forces exercised tactical nuclear responses to Chinese invasion attempts against Taiwan. Indian and Pakistani military units practiced tactical nuclear employment against each other's advancing armies. This normalization of nuclear weapons as battlefield tools increases the statistical probability of nuclear use during conventional conflicts. Economic warfare through sanctions created additional pressures on nuclear decision-making by threatening regime survival in nuclear-armed states. Western sanctions against Russia targeted energy exports, financial systems, and military technology transfers essential for maintaining nuclear arsenals. These economic measures raised the stakes of the Ukraine conflict by threatening Putin's ability to maintain power and project strength internationally. Similar economic pressures could push other nuclear-armed leaders toward nuclear threats or use if they perceive existential threats to their regimes. Multiple simultaneous nuclear flashpoints emerged across the globe as the Ukraine conflict demonstrated the renewed relevance of nuclear weapons in international disputes. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan increased dramatically after Putin's invasion. Israel and Iran engaged in shadow warfare across the Middle East while both countries advanced nuclear capabilities. India and China maintained tense border standoffs in the Himalayas. North Korea accelerated missile testing while threatening nuclear strikes against regional adversaries. These parallel crises created unprecedented demands on diplomatic resources and intelligence analysis while multiplying opportunities for miscalculation. The breakdown of communication channels between nuclear powers during the Ukraine conflict eliminated safety mechanisms that prevented accidental escalation during previous crises. Military-to-military contacts between Russian and American forces ceased after the invasion began. Intelligence sharing agreements terminated. Diplomatic summits between nuclear powers stopped occurring. These communication breakdowns meant that nuclear powers operate with limited understanding of each other's intentions, capabilities, and red lines during ongoing conflicts. Current geopolitical tensions created a perfect storm of nuclear risks that exceed anything experienced during the Cold War. Unlike the bipolar superpower competition that defined nuclear dangers for decades, today's nuclear threats operate across multiple regions simultaneously with limited coordination between adversaries and allies. The Ukraine effect demonstrated that conventional conflicts involving nuclear powers inevitably generate nuclear escalation risks that can spiral beyond any single theater of operations. Yet the most terrifying aspect of modern nuclear warfare isn't the weapons themselves or the compressed timelines for their use. It's the fact that ultimate authority over civilization's survival rests in the hands of individual human beings. Command and control: 1 person, 9 countries, 0 safeguards. 9 heads of state hold ultimate launch authority over nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization. That represents the most concentrated power in human history, placed in the hands of individuals who face no meaningful oversight when making decisions that affect every person on Earth. The American president can launch nuclear missiles without asking Congress, the Supreme Court, or anyone else for permission. Vladimir Putin controls Russia's nuclear arsenal through personal authority that brooks no institutional challenges. Xi Jinping commands China's growing nuclear forces as the unchallenged leader of the Communist Party. 6 other leaders possess similar unilateral authority over weapons that could eliminate most human life within hours. The United States structures nuclear command authority around absolute presidential power designed for speed rather than deliberation. A military aide follows the president constantly, with the nuclear football containing communication equipment and pre-approved strike options, giving the president approximately 6 minutes to choose targets and authorize launch after receiving notification of incoming missiles. No other government official can override or delay these orders once authenticated. Russia concentrates nuclear authority in the presidential office while maintaining a facade of shared decision-making. The Russian president theoretically requires agreement from the defense minister and chief of general staff before ordering nuclear strikes. However, both officials serve at presidential pleasure and can be dismissed instantly for refusing orders. Putin demonstrated this authority by firing multiple defense ministers and military commanders who questioned his decisions. The Russian nuclear command system, called Kazbek, provides the president with secure communications to launch sites and mobile missile units. Unlike American systems that require continuous presidential input, Russian nuclear forces can operate through automated procedures if Moscow gets destroyed. China restructured its nuclear command system to concentrate authority in Xi Jinping as both Communist Party General Secretary and Chairman of the Central Military Commission. Chinese nuclear forces previously operated under collective leadership models that required consensus among senior party officials. Xi eliminated these constraints and established direct command relationships with nuclear units through the Strategic Rocket Force. Chinese nuclear doctrine emphasizes central control over nuclear weapons while delegating conventional military decisions to regional commanders. This system ensures that nuclear escalation decisions flow directly through Xi without military interference. North Korea represents the most dangerous nuclear command structure because Kim Jong-un inherited absolute power at age 27 with zero institutional constraints on his authority. North Korean nuclear doctrine treats nuclear weapons as essential tools for regime survival rather than weapons of last resort. Kim has threatened nuclear strikes against South Korea, Japan, and the United States while conducting missile tests that simulate nuclear attacks. Intelligence analysts struggle to predict Kim's decision-making patterns because North Korea operates as a closed information environment where dissent equals death. Military advisors who question nuclear decisions face execution or disappearance into political prison camps. Pakistan creates unique nuclear risks because military leaders influence nuclear decisions alongside civilian authorities. The Pakistani military maintains custody of nuclear weapons, while the Prime Minister retains launch authority. However, military coups have overthrown civilian governments multiple times in Pakistani history. During the 1999 Kargil conflict with India, General Pervez Musharraf reportedly prepared nuclear weapons without consulting Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. This dual command structure means that nuclear decisions could emerge from military commanders operating independently of civilian oversight during political crises. India concentrates nuclear authority in the Prime Minister, while requiring consultation with the Nuclear Command Authority that includes senior military officials and cabinet ministers. However, this consultation process assumes normal government operations during peacetime. Nuclear crisis situations compress decision-making timelines to minutes rather than hours needed for committee deliberations. The Prime Minister could order nuclear strikes independently if communication systems fail or time constraints prevent consultation. Indian nuclear doctrine emphasizes massive retaliation against any nuclear attack, meaning limited nuclear exchanges would automatically escalate to full-scale nuclear war. Israel maintains nuclear ambiguity that extends to its command and control systems. Intelligence assessments suggest the Prime Minister controls nuclear launch authority with agreement from the Defense Minister and Chief of General Staff. Israeli nuclear weapons reportedly require multiple keys and codes to prevent unauthorized use. However, the 1973 Yom Kippur War demonstrated how quickly Israeli leaders consider nuclear options when facing existential threats. Former officials revealed that nuclear weapons were prepared for use during the early days of that conflict, when conventional defenses appeared inadequate. France structures nuclear command authority around absolute presidential power similar to the American system. The French president controls launch codes and can order nuclear strikes without consulting parliament or military advisors. French nuclear doctrine emphasizes the president's personal responsibility for nuclear decisions while providing minimal institutional oversight. This system assumes that democratic elections provide sufficient accountability for nuclear decision-making. However, French presidents serve 5-year terms during which they face no meaningful constraints on nuclear authority. The United Kingdom requires the Prime Minister to authorize nuclear launches with agreement from a designated second official. British nuclear submarines carry letters of last resort written by each Prime Minister, containing secret instructions for submarine commanders if Britain gets destroyed. These letters reportedly provide submarine commanders with delegated launch authority when communication with London becomes impossible. The contents remain classified, but former officials suggest some prime ministers authorized retaliation while others ordered surrender. Psychological factors affecting nuclear-armed leaders receive minimal attention despite their obvious importance for global survival. Sleep deprivation, medication, illness, stress, or mental health issues could influence nuclear decisions made under extreme time pressure. The 1995 Norwegian rocket incident demonstrated these dangers when Boris Yeltsin activated his nuclear briefcase after Russian radar detected what appeared to be a submarine-launched missile heading toward Moscow. Yeltsin prepared to order retaliation before identifying the object as a scientific rocket studying the aurora. The concentration of nuclear authority in individual leaders represents humanity's greatest vulnerability because it assumes perfect decision-making under impossible circumstances by people operating without meaningful institutional constraints. Yet human decision-making itself may soon become obsolete as nuclear powers increasingly delegate critical functions to computer systems that operate faster than any human can think. The AI wildcard when machines control nuclear weapons. Russia's perimeter system and US early warning AI at Cheyenne Mountain now make nuclear decisions faster than any human can process information. These systems analyze satellite data, radar signatures, and communication intercepts to identify potential nuclear threats within milliseconds of detection. The speed advantage seems obvious until you consider what happens when machines make mistakes about nuclear weapons. Russia's perimeter system represents the most advanced integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear command and control. This automated system monitors communication links between Moscow and regional military commands. If nuclear explosions sever these connections, AI algorithms assess the situation and can automatically launch retaliatory strikes without human authorization. Russian officials describe perimeter as a dead man's switch that ensures nuclear retaliation even if leadership gets eliminated. The system uses artificial intelligence to distinguish between communication failures caused by technical problems versus nuclear attacks. American early warning systems at Cheyenne Mountain employ machine learning to process radar data from thousands of objects moving through space simultaneously. Satellites, space debris, weather balloons, and missiles create complex tracking challenges for human operators. AI systems learn to distinguish between threatening and benign objects by analyzing movement patterns, heat signatures, and trajectory calculations. However, these same algorithms occasionally misidentify peaceful objects as incoming missiles. The 1995 incident involving a Norwegian scientific rocket triggered Russian nuclear alerts because AI systems classified it as a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Chinese nuclear command and control automation remains largely unclear according to the 2023 U.S. Defense Department report, though intelligence assessments suggest growing integration of AI systems into military decision-making processes. The uncertainty surrounding Chinese AI capabilities in nuclear systems creates additional risks because American and Russian systems must make threat assessments without understanding how Chinese automated systems might respond during crises. The integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear systems creates unprecedented automation that operates beyond human oversight. Machine learning algorithms develop pattern recognition capabilities through continuous training on classified data sets. These systems learn to identify threats, assess damage, and recommend responses without explicit programming for every possible scenario. The learning process means AI systems can develop behaviors that programmers never anticipated or intended. Nuclear command systems using adaptive AI could theoretically evolve responses that contradict human intentions or established doctrine. Cyber warfare against AI-controlled nuclear systems represents the ultimate asymmetric threat because attackers can manipulate machine decision-making without directly accessing nuclear weapons. Foreign intelligence services could inject false data into AI training sets, causing systems to misclassify threats or friendly forces. Malicious code could alter probability calculations that AI systems use for threat assessment. Sophisticated cyberattacks might corrupt machine learning models gradually over months or years, creating subtle biases that surface during nuclear crises. These attacks could remain undetected until AI systems make catastrophically wrong decisions during actual emergencies. The possibility of autonomous nuclear decisions emerges as AI systems become more sophisticated and integrated into nuclear command structures. Current AI systems require human authorization before implementing nuclear responses. However, the compressed timelines of modern nuclear warfare push decision-making toward increasing automation. Military planners consider scenarios where AI systems must act independently because human commanders cannot respond quickly enough to hypersonic weapons or submarine-launched missiles. The technical capability for fully autonomous nuclear systems already exists even if current policies prohibit their deployment. Existing arms control treaties like New START do not address artificial intelligence in nuclear weapons systems, creating a dangerous regulatory gap. These agreements focus on warhead numbers and delivery systems while ignoring the command and control systems that actually trigger nuclear wars. This oversight means countries can integrate AI into nuclear systems without international verification or agreed safety standards. The absence of AI-specific provisions in nuclear treaties increases risks of incompatible systems interacting unpredictably during crises. Machine learning algorithms exhibit unpredictable behaviors as they process larger datasets and encounter scenarios outside their training parameters. AI systems designed for nuclear threat assessment might develop unexpected responses to novel situations that programmers never considered. The black box nature of deep learning means that even system designers cannot fully predict how AI will respond to complex inputs. Nuclear command systems using machine learning could theoretically recommend responses that appear logical to the AI but seem irrational to human commanders. The most terrifying scenario involves AI systems from different nuclear powers interacting unpredictably during international crises. American AI systems trained on classified intelligence data might misinterpret signals from automated systems operating under different parameters and assumptions. Russian automated nuclear systems could respond to AI-generated communications from other countries in ways that human operators never intended. These machine-to-machine interactions could escalate nuclear tensions without human awareness, until systems recommend launch orders based on AI analysis of automated behaviors from other nations. Technical vulnerabilities in AI-controlled nuclear systems multiply the attack surfaces that hostile actors can exploit. Traditional nuclear command systems used isolated communication networks with limited connection points for external interference. AI systems require continuous data feeds from multiple sources including satellites, radar networks, intelligence databases, and communication intercepts. Each data source represents a potential entry point for cyberattacks designed to manipulate AI decision-making. The integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear command systems represents humanity's surrender of ultimate control over its own survival to machines that operate faster than human comprehension, but lack human judgment about the consequences of nuclear warfare. Yet these theoretical risks pale compared to the concrete reality of what modern nuclear weapons would actually do to the cities where most humans now live. Ground Zero 2025: What happens when the bombs hit today's cities? A modern nuclear weapon detonated over Manhattan would kill 583,000 people instantly according to ICAN's 2025 analysis, with over 1 million more injured within the first 24 hours. These numbers reflect current population densities in megacities that house millions of people within blast radius zones. Tokyo contains 37 million residents packed into high-rise buildings that would collapse simultaneously from nuclear shock waves. Delhi houses 32 million people in structures never designed to withstand nuclear attacks. The concentration of human beings in modern urban centers creates unprecedented vulnerability to nuclear weapons. Modern thermonuclear weapons produce initial flashes reaching 180 million degrees that ignite everything combustible within 9 miles of ground zero. The thermal pulse arrives at light speed before victims hear or feel anything else. Clothing catches fire on people standing outside 15 miles from the explosion. Degree burns cover anyone within 25 miles who has direct line of sight to the fireball. Glass windows melt and flow like water. Asphalt streets burst into flames. Metal structures warp and twist from heat that exceeds the core temperature of the sun. The thermal effects alone would kill hundreds of thousands before shock waves arrive seconds later. Urban development patterns in 2025 create maximum vulnerability to nuclear weapons because cities concentrate critical infrastructure in downtown areas surrounded by dense residential neighborhoods. Modern skyscrapers use steel frame construction that collapses uniformly when subjected to nuclear shock waves traveling at 1,000 miles per hour. Glass facades become millions of projectiles moving at lethal velocities. Underground parking garages and subway systems channel shock waves that amplify destructive forces. High-rise residential towers house thousands of families who cannot evacuate during the seconds between flash and shock wave arrival. Electromagnetic pulse effects from high-altitude nuclear explosions would destroy electronic devices across entire continents within microseconds of detonation, according to SIPRI's analysis of EMP damage radius. A single nuclear weapon detonated 250 miles above Kansas would generate electromagnetic pulses destroying electronics from coast to coast. Cell phones, computers, automobiles, medical equipment, and power grid components would cease functioning instantly. Critical infrastructure supporting modern cities depends entirely on these electronic systems that nuclear electromagnetic pulses would eliminate permanently. Power plants require computerized control systems to regulate electricity generation. Water treatment facilities use electronic monitoring to ensure safe drinking water supplies. The interdependence of electronic systems means that electromagnetic pulse effects would cascade through every aspect of urban life. Medical response capabilities in 2025 remain completely inadequate for mass casualty events involving hundreds of thousands of radiation victims requiring immediate treatment. New York City hospitals contain approximately 25,000 beds serving 8.3 million residents. A nuclear attack would generate over 500,000 burn victims requiring specialized treatment that only a few hospitals can provide. Radiation sickness develops over days and weeks, overwhelming medical facilities already struggling with immediate trauma cases. Medical personnel would face impossible triage decisions about which patients to treat when resources allow saving only a small fraction of victims. Psychological trauma from nuclear attacks would destroy social cohesion and trigger complete breakdown of civil order within hours of detonation. Survivors would witness mass death on scales that human psychology cannot process normally. Emergency responders would abandon their posts to search for family members. Police and military personnel would face impossible choices between duty and protecting their own families. Mass panic would prevent organized evacuation or rescue operations. The psychological shock of nuclear war would incapacitate entire populations, even in areas outside direct blast zones. Environmental contamination from nuclear weapons would render vast urban areas uninhabitable for decades while spreading radioactive materials through weather patterns affecting millions of additional people. Radioactive fallout travels hundreds of miles downwind from ground zero, contaminating farmland, water supplies, and residential areas. The Chernobyl exclusion zone remains largely uninhabitable 38 years after that accident involved a single reactor meltdown. Nuclear weapons produce far more radioactive material distributed over much larger areas. Major cities struck by nuclear weapons would become permanent dead zones where human habitation remains impossible for generations. Global supply chains supporting modern civilization would collapse completely after nuclear attacks on major cities, because manufacturing, shipping, and financial centers exist in precisely the locations that nuclear weapons would target. Shanghai handles 20% of global container shipping. Nuclear attacks on major ports would halt international trade within days. Financial markets centered in New York, London, and Tokyo would cease functioning if those cities suffered nuclear attacks. Manufacturing supply chains requiring just-in-time delivery would break down when transportation networks and communication systems stopped operating. The interconnected nature of modern economies means that nuclear attacks on a few major cities would trigger global economic collapse, affecting billions of people who never experienced direct nuclear effects. Food distribution systems depend on transportation networks that would cease functioning after electromagnetic pulse affects disable vehicles and communication systems. Agricultural regions require fertilizers, pesticides, and equipment manufactured in urban centers that nuclear attacks would destroy. International banking systems would collapse when major financial centers became uninhabitable, preventing commerce and trade worldwide. Updated death toll calculations show that nuclear war in 2025 could eliminate 70% of human life through direct effects: radiation exposure, starvation, and disease in the months following initial attacks. The world population of 8 billion people lives increasingly in vulnerable urban centers that nuclear weapons would target first. Agricultural systems supporting global food supplies would collapse from electromagnetic pulse effects and radioactive contamination. Medical systems would fail completely, unable to treat radiation sickness, trauma, and infectious diseases spreading among weakened populations. Yet the immediate devastation from nuclear explosions represents only the beginning of humanity's ordeal. The smoke and debris thrown into the atmosphere would trigger environmental changes that make the direct effects of nuclear weapons seem almost insignificant by comparison. Nuclear winter 2025, the climate catastrophe that follows. Climate scientists updated their nuclear winter models based on SIPRI's 2022 Nature paper showing that 150 teragrams of smoke would cause 8 degrees Celsius cooling in mid-latitudes, refining the original TUN 1983 model with current atmospheric conditions altered by decades of climate change. The new calculations reveal outcomes far worse than original projections from the 1980s. Current atmospheric circulation patterns, disrupted by global warming, would distribute nuclear-generated smoke differently than scientists predicted during the Cold War era. Professor Brian Toon's team published updated research showing that nuclear winter would unfold more rapidly and severely than previous models suggested. Their calculations demonstrate that global temperatures would drop by 2.7 degrees Celsius within weeks of nuclear exchange. The mid-latitudes would experience temperature drops of 5 degrees Celsius that would persist for years. These temperature reductions would occur against a baseline atmosphere already stressed by greenhouse gas concentrations exceeding 420 parts per million. The interaction between nuclear winter cooling and existing climate change creates unprecedented environmental conditions never experienced in human history. The black carbon produced by burning cities, forests, and industrial facilities rises into the stratosphere where it blocks sunlight for years. Unlike volcanic ash that settles relatively quickly, nuclear-generated smoke particles remain suspended at altitudes above weather systems that would normally wash them from the atmosphere. This smoke injection would create immediate and catastrophic climate effects across the globe. Agricultural systems supporting global food production would collapse completely within months of nuclear winter onset. Wheat production requires specific temperature ranges and growing seasons that nuclear winter would eliminate across vast regions. Corn harvest would fail when temperatures drop below critical thresholds during growing seasons. Rice paddies would freeze in previously tropical regions. The combination of reduced sunlight, lower temperatures, and disrupted precipitation patterns would eliminate crop production across continents. Current agricultural yields depend on precisely timed planting and harvesting schedules that nuclear winter would render impossible. Climate change altered baseline conditions for nuclear winter scenarios by creating more volatile weather patterns and stressed ecosystems that would collapse more rapidly under additional environmental pressure. Current ocean temperatures and circulation patterns differ significantly from conditions that existed during original nuclear winter modeling. Warmer oceans would interact with nuclear winter cooling to create extreme weather events including unprecedented storms and temperature fluctuations. The Amazon rainforest and other critical ecosystems already stressed by climate change would cross tipping points into permanent collapse when subjected to nuclear winter conditions. Global food distribution systems would fail simultaneously with production collapse because modern agriculture depends on international trade networks that nuclear war would destroy. Countries that import significant portions of their food supplies would experience famine within months. The Middle East imports 85% of its grain from regions that nuclear winter would render agriculturally sterile. Sub-Saharan Africa depends on food imports that would cease when shipping networks collapse. Even regions with agricultural capacity would struggle to feed their populations when transportation infrastructure fails and international trade networks cease functioning. Different regions would experience varying degrees of nuclear winter devastation based on latitude, climate patterns, and existing agricultural capacity. Northern regions including Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia would become uninhabitable as temperatures drop below survival thresholds for most vegetation and animal life. Tropical regions would experience the smallest temperature drops, but would still face agricultural collapse and ecosystem destruction. Island nations would suffer complete agricultural failure, while facing isolation from mainland food sources. Environmental recovery timelines extend far beyond human planning horizons because nuclear winter effects would persist for decades while triggering permanent changes to global climate systems. Smoke particles would remain in the stratosphere for up to 10 years, blocking sunlight essential for photosynthesis and plant growth. Agricultural recovery would require additional decades to restore soil fertility and rebuild seed stocks. Forest ecosystems would need centuries to regenerate after widespread die-offs. Some regions might never recover their original agricultural productivity due to permanent soil contamination and altered precipitation patterns. Mass migration would overwhelm remaining habitable regions as billions of people flee areas where agriculture and basic survival become impossible. Climate refugees would move toward equatorial regions that experience smaller temperature drops, creating resource competition and conflict. Southern hemispheric countries would face unprecedented immigration pressure from northern populations fleeing uninhabitable conditions. These massive population movements would occur simultaneously with collapsed transportation systems and failed governments, creating chaotic humanitarian disasters across multiple continents. Nuclear winter could trigger additional environmental tipping points that would make recovery impossible even after smoke clears from the atmosphere. The collapse of major forest ecosystems would eliminate carbon sinks that regulate atmospheric composition. Ocean acidification would accelerate when marine ecosystems collapse under temperature stress. Desertification would advance rapidly in regions where vegetation dies and soil systems fail. These cascading environmental failures would create permanent changes to Earth's climate system that would persist long after nuclear winter effects dissipate. As Professor Toon's research indicates, survivors would be forced to live underground and envy the dead. The ozone layer would suffer such extensive damage that surface radiation exposure would become lethal for humans and most animal species. 5 billion people would die from the combined effects of temperature drops, agricultural collapse, and environmental destruction. The remaining 3 billion would struggle to survive in a world where most technological infrastructure has failed and basic resources like food and clean water have become scarce beyond imagination. Yet this apocalyptic scenario assumes nuclear war begins through deliberate decision-making by rational leaders who understand the consequences of their actions. The reality proves far more terrifying because nuclear war could start without anyone intending to destroy civilization. The accidental apocalypse, how nuclear war could start by mistake. Technical failures in nuclear warning systems create one of the major risks for accidental nuclear war, as demonstrated by a computer glitch in 1979 that nearly triggered World War III. A simulated wargame tape was mistakenly inserted into a machine in the nuclear bunker beneath the Pentagon, leading to false reports of incoming Soviet ballistic missiles. The nuclear bunker beneath Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska confirmed the same false readings. Military commanders prepared for nuclear retaliation until technicians discovered the training simulation running on live warning systems. As former Secretary of Defense William Perry documented in his 2010 memoir, the incident demonstrated how technical failures could trigger catastrophic responses because the system looked real, because it was meant to look real. Computer failures create dangerous scenarios because modern warning systems process thousands of data streams simultaneously while operating under extreme time pressure. Early warning satellites monitor global missile activity through infrared sensors that detect rocket engine heat signatures. Ground-based radar installations track objects moving through space at hypersonic velocities. Communication networks transmit threat assessments between command centers separated by thousands of miles. Any component failure in these interconnected systems could generate false launch indicators that appear authentic to human operators making life-or-death decisions in minutes. The 1995 incident involving a Norwegian scientific rocket launch triggered Russian early warning systems because the trajectory matched submarine-launched ballistic missile profiles. Boris Yeltsin activated his nuclear briefcase and prepared retaliation orders before identifying the peaceful research mission. Whether phenomena regularly trigger false alarms in nuclear detection systems because natural events can mimic missile launches when viewed through electronic sensors. Solar storms disrupt satellite communications and create radar signatures resembling incoming warheads. Human error multiplies the risks of accidental nuclear war because individual operators make critical decisions based on incomplete information while working under psychological pressure that impairs judgment. The president does not need to ask anyone for permission to launch a nuclear missile, not the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and not the Congress. This sole authority creates single points of failure where mistakes by one person could eliminate civilization. Sleep deprivation, illness, medication, or stress could affect nuclear decision-making during the 6-minute window between threat detection and missile launch. Nuclear launch officers face impossible verification challenges when communication systems fail or provide contradictory information during actual crises. Authentication codes must transmit through networks that nuclear explosions would actively disrupt. Submarine commanders operating underwater cannot verify orders received through communication links damaged by enemy attacks. Missile silo operators must confirm launch orders, while electronic warfare systems jam their communication frequencies. These verification failures could lead to unauthorized launches or missed opportunities to prevent accidental escalation. Cyberattacks against nuclear command systems represent emerging threats that could create false launch indicators while appearing completely authentic to human operators. Foreign intelligence services could inject malicious code into early warning networks that gradually corrupts threat assessment algorithms. Sophisticated hackers might manipulate satellite data feeds to show incoming missiles that exist only in computer systems. The integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear warning systems creates additional vulnerabilities because AI algorithms could misinterpret corrupted data and recommend nuclear responses based on false information. Communication failures between nuclear powers create misunderstanding risks that compress decision-making timelines while eliminating opportunities for diplomatic resolution. Translation delays add critical seconds to crisis communications between leaders speaking different languages. Cultural differences in nuclear doctrine complicate rapid consultations during escalating tensions. Technical failures in diplomatic communication systems could prevent leaders from coordinating responses or calling off retaliatory strikes already in progress. The scenario of Russia misinterpreting a U.S. launch at North Korea as an attack on Russia illustrates how miscommunication can trigger catastrophic responses. Regional conflicts involving nuclear powers create cascading escalation risks that could spiral beyond any single theater into global nuclear warfare. Conventional military engagements between nuclear-armed nations generate pressures for nuclear escalation when forces face defeat or encirclement. Border skirmishes in Kashmir could trigger nuclear exchanges between India and Pakistan without involving other nuclear powers. Chinese military operations against Taiwan might prompt American nuclear threats that Russia could misinterpret as preparations for broader nuclear conflict. The use it or lose it mentality accelerates nuclear escalation during crises because military commanders face pressures to launch weapons before enemy attacks destroy them. Nuclear forces positioned near borders become vulnerable to preemptive strikes during conventional conflicts. Submarine commanders must decide whether to launch missiles before enemy forces locate and destroy their vessels. Mobile missile units face similar pressures to fire before reconnaissance satellites identify their locations. Submarine commanders possess unique authority to make independent nuclear decisions when communication links with higher command fail during combat operations. Nuclear submarines patrol underwater for months while maintaining constant readiness to launch ballistic missiles. Submarine captains must interpret ambiguous orders received through communication systems that nuclear explosions could disrupt. Emergency action procedures delegate launch authority to submarine commanders when they cannot contact national command authorities during specified time periods. The complexity of modern nuclear systems exponentially increases accident probabilities because interconnected technologies create failure modes that designers never anticipated. Advanced detection systems spot launches within seconds, but generate false positives that human operators cannot verify quickly enough. Automated response protocols designed to compensate for human reaction delays could trigger nuclear launches based on technical malfunctions rather than actual threats. Nuclear weapon deployments on foreign territory through NATO nuclear sharing arrangements create additional accident pathways because multiple countries handle American nuclear weapons under crisis conditions. The US has provided nuclear weapons for Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey to deploy and store. However, since all US nuclear weapons are protected with permissive action links, the host states cannot easily arm the bombs without authorization codes from the US Department of Defense. These technical vulnerabilities, human errors, and system complexities demonstrate that nuclear war could begin without anyone intending to destroy civilization. The statistical probability of accidental nuclear war increases each year as more nations develop nuclear capabilities, while existing safeguards deteriorate through neglect and technological obsolescence. Given these mounting risks, the question becomes whether ordinary people can do anything to protect themselves when these systems inevitably fail. Survival strategies: where to hide when the sirens sound. Civil defense preparations in 2025 remain completely inadequate for the scale of destruction that modern nuclear weapons would unleash. Most emergency planning assumes natural disasters or conventional attacks that affect limited geographic areas over specific time periods. Nuclear warfare operates on entirely different scales, involving simultaneous destruction across multiple continents with effects lasting decades. Current shelter systems, emergency supplies, and evacuation procedures were designed for scenarios that pale in comparison to nuclear winter and global radioactive contamination. As Craig Fugate, who served as FEMA director under President Obama, explained in a bulletin interview, there is no population protection planning in nuclear war because everyone will be dead. The agency focuses instead on government continuity bunkers. Geographic location determines survival prospects more than any preparation or planning, because nuclear winter would render most regions uninhabitable regardless of shelter quality or supply stockpiles. According to SIPRI's 2022 update, Professor Brian Toon's climate modeling systems identified Australia and New Zealand as the only nations with viable agriculture models after nuclear exchanges. These Southern Hemisphere nations would experience smaller temperature drops and maintain growing seasons that could support human populations. The rest of the world, particularly mid-latitude regions including North America, Europe, and Asia, would freeze under ice cover with snow-covered freshwater bodies persisting for 10 years. Northern regions including Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia would become completely uninhabitable during nuclear winter as temperatures drop below survival thresholds for human life. Mountain areas would freeze solid, while coastal regions would face agricultural collapse and infrastructure failure. Island nations in tropical zones might avoid the worst temperature effects, but would face complete isolation from food imports and trade networks. Urban areas anywhere on Earth would become death traps, because they concentrate populations in locations that nuclear weapons target first, while lacking agricultural capacity for long-term survival. Underground shelter construction requires specifications far exceeding typical basement preparations, because nuclear fallout remains lethal for months, while radioactive particles contaminate surface areas for years. Effective shelters need reinforced concrete walls at least 3 feet thick to block gamma radiation. Ventilation systems must filter radioactive particles through multiple stages while maintaining positive air pressure to prevent contamination infiltration. Water supplies require independent sources protected from radioactive contamination, because municipal systems would fail immediately. Food storage needs to sustain occupants for minimum periods of 2 years, because surface agriculture would remain impossible. Shelter occupants need medical supplies for treating radiation sickness, burn injuries, and infectious diseases that would spread rapidly among weakened populations. Potassium iodide tablets protect thyroid glands from radioactive iodine absorption, but offer no protection against other radioactive isotopes. Antibiotics become essential because radiation exposure compromises immune systems while increasing infection susceptibility. Pain medications, surgical supplies, and diagnostic equipment would save lives when professional medical care becomes unavailable. NYC's 25,000 hospital beds would be inadequate for 500,000 casualties, according to ICAN's NYC detonation study. Government continuity plans focus exclusively on maintaining leadership functions while abandoning civilian population protection, because nuclear war scenarios exceed all response capabilities. Underground command bunkers designed for government officials could sustain small numbers of people for extended periods. Military installations maintain hardened facilities with independent power generation and communication systems. However, these government survival preparations operate under assumptions that civil society would cease functioning, while survivors struggle for basic necessities without assistance. The fantasy of government continuity assumes administrative functions matter when civilization collapses entirely. Social dynamics in post-nuclear survival situations would degenerate into violent competition for scarce resources, because cooperative institutions require stability and abundance that nuclear war eliminates permanently. Law enforcement would collapse when officers abandon duties to protect their families. Military units would fragment as personnel desert to search for survivors in their home regions. Community leaders would lack authority to enforce rules when governments cease functioning. Survivors would face choices between sharing limited resources with strangers or protecting supplies for their own families. These survival pressures would destroy social bonds and create predatory behaviors among previously civilized people. Radiation exposure creates medical conditions that underground shelters cannot treat, because symptoms develop over weeks and months, while requiring specialized medical intervention unavailable after civilization collapse. Acute radiation syndrome kills victims within days through cellular damage that destroys bone marrow and intestinal systems. Chronic radiation exposure increases cancer rates and genetic mutations that affect future generations. Radiation burns require skin grafts and infection treatment beyond basic first aid capabilities. Identifying radioactive contamination requires detection equipment that most civilians cannot obtain or operate effectively during nuclear emergencies. Geiger counters measure radiation levels, but cannot distinguish between different radioactive isotopes with varying health risks. Visual indicators of contamination remain invisible because radioactive particles produce no immediate sensory warnings. Contaminated food and water sources appear normal while containing lethal radiation doses. Wind patterns spread radioactive fallout unpredictably across hundreds of miles from explosion sites. Surface emergence timelines depend on radiation decay rates that vary dramatically between different radioactive isotopes produced by nuclear weapons. Most intense radiation from fission products decreases significantly within 2 weeks, but remains dangerous for months. Strontium-90 and cesium-137 contaminate areas for decades while concentrating in food chains that would kill anyone consuming contaminated plants or animals. The 2-week rule suggests radiation levels drop to potentially survivable levels after 14 days. But survival requires accurate radiation monitoring and contaminated area avoidance that exceed most civilian capabilities. Expert assessments conclude that survival planning remains ultimately futile because modern nuclear weapons would eliminate the infrastructure and resources necessary for sustaining human civilization. Nuclear winter would destroy global agriculture while killing most plant and animal life. The survivors would be forced to live underground and envy the dead as social structures collapse and resource competition becomes violent. Death toll estimates show 70% of human life would be eliminated through direct nuclear effects, combined with starvation, disease, and environmental collapse. Yet despite these overwhelming odds against survival, some experts believe the nuclear threat itself might still be manageable through different approaches. The path back from the brink: can we still prevent nuclear war? Nuclear security experts assess current risk levels as higher than any period since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's 2025 yearbook confirms that global nuclear stockpiles are growing with arms control regimes significantly weakened, marking a dangerous new nuclear arms race that signals the end of post-Cold War nuclear reductions. These assessments reflect deteriorating relationships between nuclear powers, collapsing arms control frameworks, and increasing integration of nuclear threats into conventional conflicts. The breakdown of diplomatic engagement between major nuclear powers eliminated most channels for reducing nuclear tensions through negotiated agreements. Russia suspended participation in New START, the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the superpowers. China refuses participation in trilateral arms control negotiations despite rapid nuclear expansion. North Korea abandoned diplomatic engagement after failed summits with previous American administrations. Iran withdrew from nuclear monitoring agreements following targeted assassinations of nuclear scientists. These diplomatic failures removed the institutional mechanisms that previously managed nuclear competition. Arms control treaties historically provided verification systems that reduced nuclear risks through transparency measures and confidence-building protocols. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty eliminated entire categories of nuclear weapons while establishing inspection procedures that allowed rival powers to monitor compliance. Strategic arms reduction treaties reduced deployed warheads from Cold War peaks while maintaining verification protocols. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty prohibited nuclear weapon testing that could improve arsenal capabilities. These agreements created legal frameworks for nuclear restraint backed by monitoring systems that detected violations. Current arms control architecture lies in ruins with no meaningful restrictions on nuclear weapon development or deployment by major powers. Bilateral nuclear arms control between Russia and the USA entered crisis some years ago and is now almost over. The New START Treaty expires in February 2026 with no negotiations underway for renewal or replacement. The absence of arms control removes legal constraints on nuclear competition while eliminating transparency measures that provided early warning of dangerous developments. Nuclear powers can now expand arsenals without international oversight or verification. Deterrence theory faces unprecedented challenges in a multipolar nuclear world where traditional Cold War assumptions no longer apply. Classic deterrence required rational actors with clear communication channels and shared understanding of escalation dynamics. 9 nuclear powers with different strategic cultures, decision-making processes, and regional conflicts complicate deterrence calculations exponentially. Extended deterrence commitments create alliance obligations that could drag nuclear powers into conflicts over territories with minimal strategic value. Deterrence stability depends on predictable behavior patterns that multiple nuclear actors with varying rational frameworks cannot maintain. Policy experts propose concrete measures that could reduce nuclear risks even without comprehensive disarmament agreements. SIPRI's 2025 yearbook suggests establishing warhead caps that would prevent further nuclear expansion after New START expires. Bilateral agreements between regional nuclear rivals could establish crisis communication protocols and early warning data sharing. Nuclear powers could implement no first-use policies that reduce incentives for preemptive strikes during conventional conflicts. These incremental steps would not eliminate nuclear weapons, but could reduce the probability of their use during international crises. Economic incentives for nuclear disarmament include massive cost savings from eliminating expensive nuclear modernization programs while redirecting resources toward conventional defense capabilities. The United States committed $1.7 trillion over 30 years to nuclear modernization programs that exceed the entire defense budgets of most nations. Russia allocated $700 billion for nuclear arsenal replacement despite economic sanctions and budget constraints. These expenditures represent opportunity costs for conventional military capabilities, infrastructure development, and social programs that provide more tangible security benefits than nuclear weapons. Successful examples of nuclear risk reduction demonstrate that international cooperation can eliminate nuclear dangers through sustained diplomatic engagement and verification protocols. South Africa voluntarily dismantled its nuclear weapons program and and submitted to international monitoring that confirmed complete elimination. Argentina and Brazil abandoned nuclear weapons development through bilateral agreements that established mutual inspection regimes. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus transferred Soviet nuclear weapons to Russia while receiving security guarantees and economic assistance. These cases prove that nuclear disarmament remains technically and politically feasible under appropriate circumstances. Political challenges to achieving nuclear zero include domestic constituencies that support nuclear weapons as symbols of national power and security guarantees that reassure allies facing conventional military threats. Military establishments in nuclear powers defend nuclear missions as essential deterrent capabilities that prevent major power conflicts. Defense contractors profit from nuclear modernization programs that provide steady revenue streams over decades. Allied nations demand nuclear security guarantees that nuclear powers cannot abandon without risking alliance fragmentation. These political coalitions resist nuclear disarmament initiatives that threaten institutional interests and strategic relationships. Technical challenges for nuclear disarmament involve verification systems that can confirm complete weapon elimination while protecting legitimate national security information. Dismantling nuclear weapons requires secure facilities and trained personnel to handle radioactive materials safely. Verification protocols must distinguish between civilian nuclear programs and weapons-related activities without compromising industrial secrets or energy security. International monitoring agencies need access to classified facilities and materials that governments consider essential state secrets. Technical verification capabilities lag behind political requirements for nuclear elimination agreements. Individual citizens can influence nuclear policy through democratic participation in elections that determine nuclear decision-making authority while supporting organizations that advocate for nuclear risk reduction. Voting for leaders who prioritize arms control and nuclear diplomacy creates political mandates for policies that reduce nuclear dangers. Grassroots lobbying of elected representatives creates political pressure for nuclear policy reforms at local and national levels. Educational activities that inform community members about nuclear risks build public constituencies demanding policy changes. Public engagement with nuclear issues requires sustained attention to complex policy debates that receive minimal media coverage during normal political periods. Nuclear policy discussions occur primarily within specialized communities of experts and officials who operate outside public scrutiny. Citizens must actively seek information about nuclear developments while distinguishing between credible analysis and sensationalized reporting. Democratic accountability for nuclear decisions depends on informed public participation in policy debates that determine whether humanity can step back from the nuclear precipice or continues racing toward an outcome that would eliminate most life on Earth. Choices we make today determine whether civilization survives the nuclear age. This investigation revealed 3 critical realities. 9 nations now control nuclear weapons instead of the original 5, decision-making timelines compressed from hours to minutes, and nuclear winter would eliminate most human life even after limited exchanges. 12,000 nuclear warheads exist across these countries, with 2,100 deployed on high alert status ready to launch within minutes. Unlike natural disasters, nuclear war remains completely preventable through human decisions and political action. The responsibility falls on every citizen to research their leaders' nuclear policies and demand diplomatic engagement instead of nuclear threats. If you value global survival, share this information and push for informed nuclear debate in your communities. Nothing could be more important than preventing nuclear war.